Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty and watched the alien fleet appear on his screens. 300 ships had just dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system. Each vessel was massive and gleaming with crystal-like hulls that caught the light from distant stars. The Liberty was humanity's newest warship, but compared to these alien giants, it looked like a small fishing boat next to an aircraft carrier. Admiral Lisa Carter's voice crackled through the communications system from Luna Station. Her tone was calm, but Jake could hear the worry underneath. The readings were coming in from their long-range sensors, and the numbers were not good. The alien fleet had enough firepower to turn Earth into space dust within hours. Humanity's entire defensive fleet consisted of only 47 ships, and most of those were converted cargo vessels with basic weapons bolted onto their hulls. The alien communication came through the universal translator with a voice that sounded like grinding metal mixed with ice. Fleet Commander Zixthak of the Hegemony Empire spoke with the kind of bored tone someone might use when stepping on an ant. His words made Jake's blood run cold, but also sparked something angry in his chest. Primitive mammals of the third planet. We have watched your pathetic attempts at space travel for decades. Your metal constructs are amusing toys that barely qualify as spacecraft. We have come to claim your world and add it to our empire. You will serve as laborers in our factories and mines. Your resistance would be pointless, as your largest vessels could not damage our smallest scout ships. You have one rotation of your planet to surrender, or we will demonstrate why 3,000 species have bowed before the hegemony. Chief Engineer Ben Davis wiped sweat from his forehead as he checked the Liberty's experimental systems one more time. The ship represented 10 years of humanity's best engineering and scientific breakthroughs. Everything about it was untested in real combat. The fusion reactors could theoretically produce 3 times more power than any previous human design, but the stress might cause them to explode. The gravitational shielding was based on alien technology they had reverse-engineered from a crashed scout ship, but the computer simulations showed only a 60% chance of working properly. Lieutenant. Commander Amy Foster ran her fingers across the tactical display showing the enemy formation. The aliens had arranged their ships in a classic battle formation that looked impressive, but revealed their arrogance. They expected to simply overwhelm Earth's defenses through superior numbers and technology. Their ships moved with the confidence of predators who had never faced serious opposition. Amy had studied every piece of data about hegemony tactics, and their biggest weakness was that they never adapted to unexpected situations. The quantum torpedo launchers represented humanity's biggest gamble. Dr. Rachel Stone had designed the weapons based on theoretical physics that pushed the boundaries of known science. Each torpedo contained a compressed gravitational field that would theoretically bypass conventional shields and armor. The problem was that they had only been tested in computer simulations and against unmanned targets in deep space. Nobody knew if they would work against actual enemy ships or if they might malfunction and destroy the Liberty instead. Navigation Officer Tony Clark plotted their approach through the asteroid belt while trying to keep his hands steady. The Liberty would need to use the cover of the floating rocks to get close enough for their experimental weapons to be effective. The ship's stealth systems were also untested, and if the aliens detected them too early, the mission would end before it began. Tony had run the calculations 100 times, and every scenario required perfect timing and more luck than any sane person should rely on. Communications Officer Laura Martin monitored the alien transmissions and translated their tactical communications. The hegemony fleet was already beginning to move toward Earth's inner system with the casual confidence of conquerors who had done this many times before. Their ships spread out in hunting formation while their commanders discussed which human cities would make the best examples when they began their bombardment. President Helen Brooks watched the tactical display from the war room deep beneath the Pentagon. General Carl Hughes stood beside her, pointing out the impossible odds they faced. Earth's conventional fleet would last perhaps 10 minutes against the alien weapons. The Liberty was their only hope, but it was an experimental ship, crewed by volunteers who knew they were probably flying to their deaths. Captain Morrison looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. 300 men and women had volunteered for this mission, knowing that their families and everyone they had ever known depended on their success. The Liberty groaned slightly as Chief Davis pushed the experimental engines to full power. Warning lights flickered across every console as systems designed in laboratories prepared to face the reality of combat. The alien fleet continued its approach toward Earth with the inevitability of a natural disaster. Commander Zixthak reviewed the intelligence reports about human technology one more time and dismissed them with contempt. These mammals had barely learned to leave their own planet, and their weapons were centuries behind hegemony standards. The conquest would be over before the next solar cycle, and another species would kneel before the empire that had ruled the galaxy for millennia. The hegemony intelligence reports painted humanity as a species barely worthy of conquest. Commander Zixthak scrolled through the data, while his flagship Eternal Dominion led the fleet deeper into the solar system. The humans had discovered nuclear fusion only recently, and their fastest ships still relied on chemical rockets for basic maneuvering. Their weapons were crude plasma cannons and nuclear missiles that would bounce harmlessly off hegemony shields. The analysis showed that Earth's largest warship was called the Liberty, and it appeared to be nothing more than an oversized transport vessel. The humans had grafted weapons and armor onto its hull in a desperate attempt to create something that might threaten a real warship. The intelligence officers estimated it would last perhaps 30 seconds against a hegemony destroyer before being reduced to scrap metal and vapor. Dr. Rachel Stone worked frantically in the Liberty's laboratory section while the ship moved through the asteroid belt toward their target. The quantum torpedoes were her life's work, but she had never imagined they would be tested against an actual enemy fleet. Each weapon contained technology that pushed physics to its absolute limits. If her calculations were wrong, the torpedoes might create gravitational anomalies that could destroy the Liberty along with their targets. The weapon worked by compressing space-time into an incredibly dense point and then releasing that energy in a controlled explosion. The theoretical result would bypass any known form of shielding because the gravitational effects would ignore electromagnetic barriers and physical armor. The problem was that nobody had ever created weapons using compressed gravity before, and the margin for error was essentially zero. Chief Engineer Davis monitored the fusion reactors as they climbed toward dangerous power levels. The Liberty's experimental engines could theoretically produce enough energy to power a small city, but the stress on the ship's hull was enormous. Metal supports groaned under forces they were never designed to handle, and temperature readings climbed into the red zones across multiple systems. The gravitational shielding represented another massive gamble based on alien technology that humanity barely understood. The system would create localized gravity fields around the ship that could theoretically deflect incoming energy weapons. Dr. Stone had reverse-engineered the technology from debris recovered after the first alien contact 10 years ago, but translating alien science into human engineering had required countless educated guesses. Lieutenant Commander Foster studied the enemy fleet formation and identified their best targets. The hegemony ships moved in predictable patterns that suggested they had never faced serious opposition. Their largest vessels stayed in the center of the formation, while smaller ships formed protective screens around them. It was tactically sound, but also showed that they considered this mission a simple extermination rather than an actual battle. The alien communications continued to mock humanity's defensive preparations. Commander Zixthak broadcast messages describing how previous species had fallen before the hegemony war machine. He spoke of planets reduced to ash and civilizations that had thought themselves advanced until they faced the Empire's true power. His voice carried the boredom of someone describing routine maintenance rather than the destruction of an entire world. Captain Morrison felt the weight of 3 billion lives pressing down on his shoulders as he watched the tactical display. Earth's conventional fleet was already moving to intercept the alien vanguard, but everyone knew it was a delaying action at best. The destroyers and cruisers that represented humanity's best military technology would be swept aside like toys before a tsunami. Navigation Officer Clark fine-tuned their approach vector while sweat dripped down his face. The Liberty had to emerge from the asteroid belt at exactly the right moment and position to have any chance of success. Too early, and the aliens would concentrate their fire and destroy them before the experimental weapons could be brought to bear. Too late, and Earth's defenses would already be overwhelmed. The hegemony advance ships began their attack on Earth's outer defensive stations with casual efficiency. Plasma beams lanced through space and reduced heavily armored fortifications to glowing debris in seconds. The alien weapons were so far beyond human technology that the defensive stations might as well have been made of paper. Each successful attack was broadcast to the main fleet as entertainment for board crew members. Communications Officer Martin intercepted alien tactical transmissions that revealed their complete contempt for human resistance. The hegemony commanders were already discussing which human cities would provide the best examples when they began their demonstration bombardment. They spoke of reducing major population centers to crater glass as a lesson for any other primitive species that might consider resistance. President Brooks watched the destruction of humanity's outer defenses from the Emergency Command Center and felt her heart sink. The aliens were not even using their main fleet yet, and they were already cutting through Earth's best defenses like a knife through butter. The Liberty represented their only hope, but it was one experimental ship against 300 proven warships that had conquered thousands of worlds. The quantum torpedo guidance systems came online as Dr. Stone completed her final calibrations. Each weapon would need to be individually targeted because their revolutionary design meant they could not use conventional targeting computers. The gravitational effects would need to be precisely calculated for each target based on mass, velocity, and shield configuration. A single mistake in the calculations could cause the torpedo to miss completely or create a gravity well that would tear the Liberty apart. General Hughes coordinated Earth's desperate defense while knowing that conventional tactics were useless against such overwhelming technological superiority. The planet's missile defense systems were already warming up, but their nuclear warheads would be like throwing stones at a tank. The only weapons that might penetrate alien shields were the orbital plasma cannons, but they would need impossible accuracy to be effective against moving targets. Commander Zixthak reviewed the tactical situation with growing satisfaction as his fleet prepared to enter Earth's inner system. The humans were responding exactly as predicted with desperate courage, but no real hope of success. Their ships charged toward certain destruction, while their ground-based weapons prepared to fire uselessly into space. It would be over within hours, and another world would bow before the eternal dominion of the hegemony empire. The first engagement between Earth's conventional fleet and the hegemony vanguard unfolded exactly as the aliens had predicted. Admiral Carter watched from Luna Station as her best ships charged toward the enemy formation with weapons blazing. The USS Washington led the attack with its plasma cannons firing at maximum power, while nuclear missiles streaked toward their targets in waves. The hegemony response was swift and devastating. Energy shields absorbed the human weapons fire without even flickering, while return fire from the alien ships carved through Earth's vessels like they were made of tissue paper. The Washington lasted barely 8 minutes before a plasma beam punched through its armor and detonated the main reactor. The explosion lit up space for several seconds before fading to leave only expanding debris. Captain Morrison felt sick as he watched humanity's best warships die one by one on his tactical display. Each destroyed vessel represented hundreds of trained crew members and years of Earth's limited resources. The aliens were not even using their main fleet yet, and they were already systematically dismantling everything that stood between them and Earth's defenseless population. Chief Engineer Davis pushed the Liberty's experimental fusion reactors beyond their safety limits as the ship accelerated toward the combat zone. The power output readings climbed into theoretical ranges that no human technology had ever attempted. Metal support beams groaned under stresses they were never designed to handle, while warning alarms sounded throughout the ship. The gravitational shielding flickered to life around the Liberty's hull as Dr. Stone activated the experimental defensive systems. The alien technology they had reverse-engineered created invisible fields that bent space-time around the ship. Computer models suggested the system would deflect energy weapons by redirecting them through folded space, but nobody knew if the theory would work in actual combat. Lieutenant Commander Foster locked the quantum torpedo guidance systems onto their first target as the Liberty emerged from the asteroid belt. A hegemony destroyer was moving toward Earth's inner defenses, with its weapons charging for another devastating bombardment. The alien ship was 3 times larger than the Liberty and carried enough firepower to level a major city, but Amy had studied its design specifications and found what she hoped was a critical weakness. The destroyer's shields were optimized against conventional energy weapons and kinetic projectiles, but the hegemony had never encountered gravitational attacks. Their defensive systems were designed to stop plasma beams and missiles, not weapons that attacked the fundamental structure of space-time itself. If Dr. Stone's calculations were correct, the quantum torpedoes would bypass the shields entirely and tear the enemy ship apart from the inside. Navigation Officer Clark held the Liberty steady as they approached optimal firing range, while enemy sensors began to detect their presence. The hegemony ships were starting to turn toward them, but their movements showed casual interest rather than alarm. The aliens clearly considered one human warship to be insignificant regardless of where it had come from or what weapons it might carry. Commander Zixthak barely glanced at the tactical report when his officers informed him of the Liberty's approach. The human ship was moving faster than expected, and its energy signature was unusual, but it was still just one vessel against his entire fleet. He ordered a squadron of destroyers to intercept and destroy the intruder before returning his attention to the bombardment of Earth's orbital installations. The quantum torpedo launch sequence initiated as Dr. Stone made her final calculations based on the target's mass and velocity. Each weapon required precise gravitational field equations that pushed human mathematics to its absolute limits. A single error in the calculations could cause the torpedo to miss completely or create a gravity well that would tear apart both ships. Communications Officer Martin intercepted alien transmissions that revealed their complete confidence in their technological superiority. The hegemony commanders were discussing the Liberty as if it were an amusing curiosity rather than a genuine threat. They spoke of capturing the ship intact to study human engineering and add it to their collection of primitive artifacts from conquered worlds. The first quantum torpedo streaked toward its target while the Liberty's crew held their breath. The weapon moved faster than conventional missiles and left a trail of distorted space-time that was visible to sensors but not to the naked eye. Dr. Stone watched her instruments as the torpedo approached the destroyer's shields and prepared to test 10 years of theoretical physics against alien technology. The explosion was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Instead of a conventional blast, the quantum torpedo created a localized gravity well that collapsed inward on itself before expanding outward in a wave of twisted space-time. The hegemony destroyer's shields flickered and failed as gravitational forces tore through them like they were made of smoke. The alien ship's hull buckled and twisted as the gravity well grabbed it and compressed it into an impossible shape. Metal that had been forged in stellar furnaces crumpled like aluminum foil as forces beyond human understanding ripped the vessel apart at the molecular level. Within seconds, the destroyer imploded into a sphere of compressed matter before exploding, outward in a burst of energy that lit up the tactical displays. Commander Zixthak stared at his screens in disbelief as one of his destroyers simply ceased to exist. The tactical computers could not explain what had happened because the weapon signature was unlike anything in their databases. The humans had somehow created a gravitational attack that bypassed every known form of defensive technology. The second quantum torpedo found its target before the aliens could react to the first attack. Another destroyer died in the same impossible implosion, while the hegemony fleet began to show signs of confusion and alarm. Ships that had moved with casual confidence now began evasive maneuvers, while their commanders demanded explanations that nobody could provide. Chief Engineer Davis reported that the Liberty's experimental systems were holding together despite operating far beyond their design specifications. The gravitational shields were deflecting incoming fire from the alien response force, while the fusion reactors continued to provide the enormous power requirements for the quantum weapons. Warning lights flashed across every console, but the ship was still fighting. Lieutenant Commander Foster targeted the third torpedo at a hegemony cruiser that was turning to bring its main guns to bear on the Liberty. The alien vessel was larger and more heavily armed than the previous targets, but Amy was confident that size would not matter against weapons that attacked the fundamental forces of reality itself. The quantum torpedo struck the cruiser's shields and created another impossible gravity well that consumed the alien ship in seconds. The hegemony fleet was beginning to realize that they faced something completely outside their experience, as their technological advantage meant nothing against weapons that ignored conventional physics entirely. The hegemony fleet's casual confidence shattered as 3 of their warships vanished in impossible explosions. Commander Zixthak demanded answers from his tactical officers, but nobody could explain how the humans had created weapons that bypassed every known form of defensive technology. The gravity wells that consumed his ships defied everything the Empire knew about physics and warfare. Captain Morrison felt a surge of hope as he watched the alien formation begin to show signs of confusion and alarm. Ships that had moved with predatory confidence now scattered in defensive patterns while their commanders tried to understand what they were facing. The Liberty had proven that human ingenuity could surprise even the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. The alien response came swiftly as a squadron of heavy cruisers converged on the Liberty's position with their main weapons charging. Plasma beams that could melt through mountain ranges lanced through space toward the experimental human warship. Chief Engineer Davis watched his power readings spike as the gravitational shielding absorbed impacts that should have vaporized the entire vessel. Dr. Stone monitored the shield generators as they bent space-time around the Liberty to deflect the incoming fire. The alien energy beams curved away from the ship like water flowing around a stone as the gravitational fields redirected them harmlessly into space. The system was working beyond her most optimistic projections, but the power requirements were enormous and getting worse with each attack. Lieutenant Commander Foster launched another quantum torpedo at the nearest heavy cruiser while the ship shuddered under the stress of combat operations. The experimental systems were holding together, but warning lights flashed across every console as components operated far beyond their design limits. Each torpedo launch drained massive amounts of power from the already overloaded fusion reactors. The quantum weapon struck the hegemony cruiser and created another localized gravity well that compressed the alien vessel into impossible shapes before tearing it apart at the atomic level. The explosion sent shockwaves through space that were detected by sensors throughout the solar system. Admiral Carter watched from Luna Station as the impossible continued to happen before her eyes. Navigation Officer Clark adjusted their course to avoid the expanding debris field while keeping the Liberty in optimal firing position. The ship's experimental engines responded sluggishly as they approached their thermal limits, but they continued to provide the maneuverability needed to stay ahead of the alien pursuit. Sweat dripped down his face as he calculated vectors that would keep them alive for just a few more minutes. Commander Zixthak ordered his remaining ships to concentrate all firepower on the mysterious human vessel that was carving through his fleet like a blade through silk. The technological superiority that had conquered 3,000 worlds meant nothing against weapons that attacked reality itself. For the first time in his long military career, he felt something approaching fear. The Eternal Dominion and 6 heavy dreadnoughts turned their massive weapon arrays toward the Liberty, while smaller ships continued their harassment attacks. The flagship alone carried enough firepower to reduce a continent to glass, and the combined bombardment would test the human gravitational shielding beyond any reasonable limits. Communications Officer Martin intercepted frantic alien transmissions as the hegemony commanders tried to coordinate their response to an enemy they did not understand. The casual arrogance had been replaced by growing panic, as ships that had dominated space for millennia found themselves helpless against primitive mammals who should have been extinct by now. The massive bombardment from the alien dreadnoughts lit up space like a miniature star as energy weapons that could crack planets focused their fury on one small human warship. The Liberty's gravitational shields bent and twisted under forces that defied measurement, while the ship's hull groaned from stresses that pushed the laws of physics to their breaking point. Chief Engineer Davis watched his reactor readings climb into the red zones as the shield generators demanded more power than any human technology had ever produced. The experimental fusion systems were running a controlled nuclear explosion that could consume the ship if the magnetic containment fields failed for even a microsecond. Warning alarms screamed throughout the vessel as every system operated beyond its theoretical maximum. Dr. Stone felt the ship shudder around her as the gravitational shielding absorbed impacts that should have been impossible to survive. The alien technology they had reverse-engineered was performing miracles, but she could see the power drain on her instruments. The shields were holding, but they could not maintain this level of protection for much longer. The quantum torpedo guidance systems locked onto the Eternal Dominion as Lieutenant Commander Foster prepared to target the enemy flagship. The massive dreadnought was protected by shields that could stop nuclear weapons and armor that had never been penetrated in 1,000 battles. But size and armor meant nothing against weapons that compressed space-time itself into instruments of destruction. President Brooks watched the impossible battle unfold from the Emergency Command Center, while General Hughes provided commentary that sounded like science fiction rather than military analysis. One experimental human warship was fighting the entire hegemony fleet to a standstill, using weapons that should not have been possible according to known physics. The Liberty's hull began to show stress fractures as the gravitational forces around. The ship reached levels that no human engineering had ever contemplated. Metal support beams that had been forged in Earth's finest factories started to bend under the incredible forces, while the crew fought to keep their experimental systems operational for just a few more minutes. Navigation Officer Clark reported that their ammunition supply was running dangerously low as each quantum torpedo required exotic materials that could not be easily replaced. The Liberty carried only 20 of the revolutionary weapons, and they had already expended nearly half their supply. Every shot had to count if they were going to survive long enough to make a difference. Commander Zixthak stared at his tactical displays in growing horror as his fleet continued to take losses from weapons that his science officers insisted were theoretically impossible. The humans had somehow learned to weaponize gravity itself, and were using it to tear apart ships that had been invincible for countless centuries. The quantum torpedo streaked toward the Eternal Dominion, while the massive flagship's point defense systems tried desperately to intercept it. Plasma cannons and particle beams filled space around the weapon, but the torpedo's gravitational field deflected everything as it closed the final distance to its target. The fate of both fleets would be decided in the next few seconds. The quantum torpedo struck the Eternal Dominion's shields and created a gravity well that made the previous attacks look like firecrackers compared to a nuclear bomb. The massive flagship had been built to withstand planet-killing weapons, but nothing in the galaxy could resist forces that twisted space-time itself into knots. The ship's hull began to buckle and compress as gravitational fields beyond measurement tore at its molecular structure. Commander Zixthak felt his flagship dying around him as impossible forces crushed armor that had been forged in the hearts of dying stars. The bridge buckled and twisted while his crew screamed in languages from across the galaxy. Emergency systems failed one by one as the gravity well consumed everything within its reach, like a hungry black hole that had been compressed into the size of a city block. The Eternal Dominion imploded in a cascade of secondary explosions that lit up the solar system, while debris from the most powerful warship in the hegemony fleet scattered across millions of cubic kilometers of space. Admiral Carter watched from Luna Station as sensors registered energy readings that pushed their instruments beyond their maximum calibration ranges. Captain Morrison felt the Liberty shudder as the shockwave from the flagship's destruction washed over them, while Chief Engineer Davis fought to keep their overloaded systems from following the alien ship into oblivion. The experimental fusion reactors were running so far beyond their design specifications that the magnetic containment fields were starting to fluctuate dangerously. The remaining hegemony dreadnoughts began to panic as their supposedly invincible flagship vanished in an explosion that could be seen from Earth's surface. These were ships that had conquered entire star systems, and their crews had never experienced anything approaching defeat. The psychological impact of losing their command vessel to primitive mammals was almost as devastating as the tactical implications. Dr. Stone monitored the gravitational shielding as it continued to deflect incoming fire from the increasingly desperate alien survivors. The system was performing beyond her wildest expectations, but the power drain was approaching critical levels. The Liberty's experimental technology was holding together through pure determination and engineering excellence, but it could not last much longer. Lieutenant Commander Foster targeted another quantum torpedo at the nearest dreadnought, while the ship's ammunition supply dropped toward dangerously low levels. Each weapon required exotic matter that had taken months to manufacture in Earth's most advanced laboratories. They had perhaps 6 more shots before they would be reduced to conventional weapons that could barely scratch the alien armor. The quantum torpedo struck the second dreadnought and created another impossible gravity well that compressed the massive warship into a sphere of superdense matter before it exploded outward in a burst of energy that registered on sensors throughout the solar system. The hegemony fleet was beginning to break apart as ships that had dominated the galaxy for millennia fled from weapons they could not understand or counter. Navigation Officer Clark adjusted their course to pursue the fleeing alien vessels while the Liberty's experimental engines continued to push beyond their theoretical limits. The ship's hull was showing stress fractures from the gravitational forces, but it was still holding together through superior human engineering and the desperate determination of its crew. Communications Officer Martin intercepted frantic alien transmissions as the hegemony fleet coordination collapsed into chaos and panic. Ships that had approached Earth with casual confidence were now broadcasting desperate retreat orders, while their commanders tried to comprehend how their technological superiority had been turned into a fatal weakness. The third dreadnought died in another impossible implosion, as its crew realized too late that their shields and armor were useless against weapons that attacked the fundamental structure of reality itself. The hegemony empire had conquered 3,000 worlds, but they had never faced an enemy that could weaponize gravity itself. Commander Zixthax, second in command aboard the surviving command vessel, watched his fleet disintegrate before his eyes while his science officers provided explanations that sounded like insane theories rather than military analysis. The humans had somehow learned to create localized black holes and use them as weapons against ships that should have been invincible. President Brooks felt tears streaming down her face as she watched humanity's experimental warship systematically destroy the alien fleet that had come to enslave her world. The Liberty represented everything that was best about human ingenuity and determination. One ship and 300 volunteers were saving 3 billion lives through courage and scientific brilliance. Chief Engineer Davis reported that the fusion reactors were approaching critical overload as the ship's experimental systems demanded more power than any human technology had ever produced. The magnetic containment fields that kept their controlled nuclear explosion stable were fluctuating dangerously, while temperature readings climbed beyond the red zones into theoretical ranges. The fourth dreadnought exploded in another gravity-induced implosion, while the remaining hegemony ships began a full retreat toward the edge of the solar system. Ships that had approached Earth expecting an easy conquest were now fleeing from one experimental human warship that had proven the Empire's technological superiority was an illusion. Lieutenant Commander Foster prepared to launch their final quantum torpedoes at the fleeing alien vessels, while Captain Morrison made the difficult decision to let most of them escape. The Liberty's ammunition was nearly exhausted, and their experimental systems were on the verge of catastrophic failure. They had proven their point and saved Earth, but pursuing the entire enemy fleet would be suicide. Dr. Stone watched her instruments as the gravitational shielding began to fluctuate under the enormous power demands of continuous combat operations. The alien technology they had reverse-engineered was miraculous, but it was pushing human engineering beyond any reasonable limits. The Liberty had performed beyond every optimistic projection, but it could not sustain this level of output much longer. The surviving hegemony ships disappeared into hyperspace while their crews transmitted warning messages to the Empire about the impossible human weapons that had destroyed their supposedly invincible fleet. The mammals of the third planet had proven that technological superiority meant nothing against ingenuity and determination. Navigation Officer Clark began plotting a course back toward Earth, while the Liberty's experimental engines finally started. To show signs of thermal shutdown, the ship had given everything it had and more to save humanity from conquest. Warning lights flashed across every console as systems that had operated beyond their design limits finally began to fail in controlled sequences. The battlefield was littered with debris from hegemony warships that had been torn apart by weapons that should not have existed according to known physics. The Liberty limped through the wreckage of an enemy fleet that had been considered invincible until it encountered human determination and scientific brilliance combined into instruments of impossible destruction. The Liberty drifted through the debris field of the once mighty hegemony fleet, while emergency systems throughout the ship began shutting down in sequence. Chief Engineer Davis worked frantically to prevent a complete reactor failure as the experimental fusion systems finally reached their absolute limits. Steam vented from coolant lines, while warning alarms echoed through corridors that had become furnace-hot from the incredible energy output. Captain Morrison surveyed the battlefield through his main view screen and felt a mixture of triumph and exhaustion that went beyond anything he had ever experienced. Scattered across millions of cubic kilometers of space were the remains of 300 alien warships that had come to conquer Earth. The technological superiority of an empire that had dominated the galaxy for millennia had been shattered by human ingenuity and desperate courage. Dr. Stone monitored the gravitational shielding as it flickered and failed, while the exotic matter that powered the system reached critical depletion. The alien technology they had reverse-engineered had performed miracles, but it was finally exhausted after deflecting energy weapons that could have melted continents. Her instruments showed power levels dropping towards zero as the ship's experimental systems shut down one by one. Admiral Carter's voice crackled through the communications system from Luna Station with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief. The long-range sensors were confirming what seemed impossible even after witnessing it firsthand. One experimental human warship had destroyed an entire alien fleet using weapons that had existed only in theoretical physics papers just months ago. The surviving hegemony ships had fled into hyperspace, but their retreat had been broadcast across the galaxy through the Empire's communication networks. Every species that had bowed before the supposedly invincible fleet would soon learn that the mammals of the third planet had achieved something that 3,000 conquered worlds had thought impossible. Lieutenant Commander Foster secured the quantum torpedo systems as their exotic matter reserves reached empty. The weapons that had torn apart alien dreadnoughts were now useless until Earth's laboratories could manufacture more of the incredibly complex materials required for their operation. Each torpedo had cost more than a conventional warship, but they had proven their worth beyond any possible calculation. Navigation Officer Clark reported that the Liberty's experimental engines were shutting down as their thermal regulation systems finally failed. The ship was running on backup power, while emergency cooling systems tried to prevent a complete meltdown of the propulsion systems. They had enough power to reach Earth's orbit, but it would be a slow journey home for heroes who had saved their entire world. Communications Officer Martin intercepted transmissions from across the solar system as humanity's remaining ships converged on the battlefield to escort the Liberty home. The experimental warship had suffered extensive damage during its impossible victory, but it was still intact, and its crew was alive. The 300 volunteers who had accepted a suicide mission were returning as the saviors of human civilization. President Brooks authorized a fleet of rescue ships to assist the Liberty while the world below celebrated a victory that would be remembered for as long as humanity existed. The experimental warship had proven that technological advancement meant nothing compared to the ingenuity and determination of people fighting for their freedom and survival. Chief Engineer Davis managed to stabilize the fusion reactors at minimal power output, while emergency teams worked to repair the most critical systems. The Liberty would need months of repairs before it could operate at full capacity again, but the ship had accomplished something that would change the balance of power. Throughout the galaxy, human technology was no longer considered primitive by anyone who had witnessed the battle. The debris field told the story of the most one-sided naval engagement in galactic history. Pieces of alien warships that had been considered invincible drifted through space, while the single human vessel that had destroyed them limped slowly toward home. The Hegemony Empire's reputation for technological superiority had been shattered along with their fleet. General Hughes coordinated the recovery operation while analyzing the tactical implications of humanity's impossible victory. The quantum, torpedoes, and gravitational shielding had proven that human science could leap beyond alien technology when driven by necessity and desperation. Earth would never again be considered a primitive backwater by the advanced civilizations of the galaxy. Dr. Stone began documenting the performance data from their experimental systems, while the ship's computers recorded every detail of the battle for future analysis. The Liberty had been a prototype, but its success would lead to a new generation of human warships that could defend Earth against any threat. The galaxy would learn to respect humanity as equals rather than potential slaves. The long journey back to Earth gave the crew time to process what they had accomplished, while emergency repairs kept their ship functional. Captain Morrison walked through the corridors and saw exhausted faces that reflected the magnitude of their achievement. 300 volunteers had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through courage and determination that had turned theoretical science into practical weapons. The alien communication networks carried news of the Hegemony's defeat across the galaxy, while conquered species began to whisper about the possibility of freedom. The empire that had seemed eternal had been humbled by a single ship from a world they had dismissed as insignificant. The psychological impact would be felt throughout civilized space for generations. Communications from Earth brought congratulations from every nation as humanity celebrated their survival and the birth of a new era. The Liberty had not just defeated an alien fleet, but had announced to the galaxy that Earth would never bow to technological intimidation again. Human ingenuity had proven itself capable of achieving the impossible when survival was at stake. Lieutenant Commander Foster looked at her tactical displays, showing the empty space where the enemy fleet had been, and felt pride that went beyond personal achievement. The quantum torpedoes had worked exactly as Dr. Stone had calculated, despite operating beyond every known limit of physics and engineering. Human determination had turned theoretical weapons into practical tools of liberation. Navigation Officer Clark plotted their final approach to Earth, while rescue ships moved to escort them home. The Liberty's experimental engines were barely functional, but they had carried the ship through the most important battle in human history. The crew that had volunteered for a suicide mission was returning as heroes who had saved their entire species. The galaxy would never be the same after learning that the hegemony empire could be defeated by courage and scientific brilliance. The Liberty had proven that technological superiority was an illusion when faced with determination and ingenuity backed by the desperate need to protect everything that mattered. Humanity had announced its arrival as a major power through the most decisive naval victory in recorded history. The news of the hegemony fleet's destruction spread across the galaxy faster than the surviving ships could carry their warning messages. Species that had been conquered for thousands of years received the impossible reports with mixtures of disbelief and desperate hope. The empire that had seemed eternal and invincible had been humbled by a single ship from a world that most civilizations had never heard of. On the hegemony homeworld of Zarketh, the High Council received the battle reports with stunned silence. Fleet Admiral Kixdan read the tactical analysis 3 times before he could accept that 300 warships had been destroyed by one experimental vessel using weapons that their science could not explain. The mammals had somehow learned to weaponize gravity itself against ships that had dominated space for millennia. Captain Morrison stood on the Liberty's bridge as Earth grew larger in the main view screen, while a flotilla of human ships formed an honor escort around the damaged warship. The experimental vessel that had saved civilization was barely holding together, but it had accomplished something that would echo through history. The crew of 300 volunteers had changed the balance of power throughout the known galaxy. Dr. Stone compiled her research data while the ship's computers analyzed every aspect of their impossible victory. The quantum torpedoes had performed beyond her most optimistic projections by creating gravitational effects that bypassed every known form of defensive technology. The success would revolutionize human military science and provide the foundation for weapons that could defend Earth against any future threat. Chief Engineer Davis managed to keep the Liberty's systems operational long enough to reach orbital dock while emergency repair crews prepared to restore the ship that had become humanity's most valuable military asset. The experimental fusion reactors had operated far beyond their design limits, but they had proven that human engineering could achieve miracles when driven by necessity. The galactic communication networks carried detailed reports of the battle to every corner of civilized space, while military analysts tried to understand how primitive mammals had developed weapons that made the hegemony's technology obsolete. The quantum torpedoes represented a breakthrough in physics that would reshape military thinking throughout the galaxy. Admiral Carter coordinated the Liberty's return to Earth, while political leaders across the planet prepared for a new era of interstellar relations. Humanity could no longer be dismissed as a primitive species after demonstrating that their experimental technology could destroy the most advanced fleet in known space. Earth would demand respect as equals in any future negotiations. The surviving hegemony commanders transmitted desperate warnings to their home territories about the impossible human weapons that had torn apart their invincible fleet. The mammals had somehow created devices that compressed space-time into instruments of destruction that ignored conventional shields and armor. No ship in the galaxy would be safe until the Empire developed countermeasures. Lieutenant Commander Foster secured the quantum torpedo launchers while contemplating the revolution in military technology that had saved her world. The experimental weapons had proven that human ingenuity could leap beyond alien science when motivated by the need to survive. Earth's laboratories would now work to mass-produce the weapons that had turned the tide of battle. Navigation Officer Clark brought the Liberty safely into Earth's orbital shipyards, while crowds gathered across the planet to celebrate their impossible victory. The experimental warship had faced odds of 300 to 1 and emerged triumphant through superior technology and the courage of its crew. The volunteers who had accepted a suicide mission were returning as the saviors of human civilization. President Brooks addressed the United Nations while the Liberty docked at the largest orbital facility to begin extensive repairs and analysis. The experimental ship would be studied by teams of scientists and engineers who would use its success to design a new generation of human warships capable of defending Earth against any threat. The debris field from the destroyed hegemony fleet provided humanity with access to advanced alien technology that would accelerate their scientific development by centuries. Salvage operations began immediately while researchers prepared to reverse engineer innovations that had taken the Empire millennia to develop. Earth would emerge from this conflict as a major technological power. Communications Officer Martin monitored transmissions from across the galaxy as news of humanity's victory spread to every inhabited system. Species that had lived under hegemony rule for generations began to whisper about rebellion, while others sought to establish diplomatic relations with the world that had achieved the impossible. Dr. Stone's preliminary analysis confirmed that the quantum torpedoes had functioned exactly as her theoretical models had predicted, despite operating in combat conditions that pushed physics beyond every known limit. The success would lead to a revolution in human military science and provide Earth with weapons that could defend against any conceivable threat. The High Council on Zarketh convened emergency sessions to analyze the tactical implications of their fleet's destruction, while military commanders demanded explanations for how their technological superiority had become irrelevant. The mammals had somehow developed weapons that made thousands of years of hegemony military evolution obsolete in a single engagement. Chief Engineer Davis supervised the Liberty's shutdown procedures while engineering teams prepared to analyze every system that had operated beyond its design specifications. The experimental technology had held together through pure determination and superior human engineering, but the ship would need months of repairs before it could return to active service. The galactic balance of power had shifted permanently as news of the hegemony's defeat reached every corner of civilized space. Species that had accepted conquest as inevitable began to reconsider their positions, while others sought alliances with the world that had proven the Empire could be defeated. Captain Morrison addressed his crew while the Liberty settled into orbital dock, surrounded by the cheering crowds of a grateful planet. The 300 volunteers who had faced impossible odds had not only saved Earth, but had announced to the galaxy that humanity would never accept subjugation. Their courage and determination had changed the course of galactic history. The experimental warship that had been humanity's desperate gamble had become the foundation for a new era of interstellar relations. Earth would no longer be considered a primitive backwater, but would take its place among the major powers of the galaxy through scientific achievement and military prowess that had proven itself against the most advanced fleet in known space. The quantum torpedoes and gravitational shielding represented technological breakthroughs that would reshape military thinking throughout civilized space, while establishing humanity as a force that could not be ignored or conquered. The Liberty had proven that ingenuity and determination could overcome any technological disadvantage when survival was at stake. 6 months after the Battle of Saul, the galaxy had transformed into something unrecognizable from the empire that had dominated space for millennia. The hegemony's grip on their conquered territories weakened daily as species across the galaxy learned that the supposedly invincible fleet had been destroyed by a single human warship using weapons that defied every known law of physics and military science. Captain Morrison stood in the Liberty's completely rebuilt command center while the ship prepared for its first mission since the historic battle. Earth's shipyards had worked around the clock to repair and upgrade the experimental vessel while incorporating lessons learned from its impossible victory. The ship that had saved humanity now served as the flagship of Earth's rapidly expanding interstellar fleet. Dr. Stone supervised the installation of improved quantum torpedo systems based on 6 months of intensive research and development. The original weapons had been theoretical prototypes, but the new generation could be mass-produced in Earth's orbital factories. Human technology had leaped forward by centuries in the time since one desperate gamble had changed the balance of galactic power. The hegemony empire was fragmenting as rebellion erupted across hundreds of worlds while their military commanders struggled to develop countermeasures against weapons they still did not understand. The quantum torpedoes created gravitational effects that bypassed every defensive system the empire had developed over thousands of years of conquest and technological advancement. Admiral Carter reviewed intelligence reports from across the galaxy, while coordinating humanity's expanding diplomatic and military presence. Earth had received communication requests from over 200 species seeking alliance or protection against hegemony retaliation. The world that had been dismissed as primitive was now courted by civilizations that had existed for millions of years. Chief Engineer Davis monitored the Liberty's upgraded fusion reactors that incorporated improvements developed through analysis of the original battle. The experimental systems that had nearly destroyed themselves while saving Earth had been refined into reliable technology that could power a new generation of human warships. Earth's industrial capacity expanded daily to meet demand for vessels equipped with revolutionary quantum weapons. The galactic communication networks carried constant updates about the spreading rebellion against hegemony rule, while species that had been conquered for generations reclaimed their freedom. The psychological impact of humanity's victory had shattered the Empire's reputation for invincibility and inspired resistance movements that the alien overlords could not suppress. Lieutenant Commander Foster coordinated the targeting systems for the Liberty's expanded quantum torpedo arsenal while the ship prepared to escort a convoy of refugee vessels from the former hegemony territories. Earth had become a beacon of hope for species seeking freedom from imperial rule, and the quantum weapons provided protection that made human ships invincible against conventional alien technology. Navigation Officer Clark plotted courses through space that had been transformed by the collapse of the Empire's authority. Trade routes that had been controlled by the hegemony for millennia now operated under human protection, while Earth's merchant vessels carried quantum-armed escorts that guaranteed safe passage against any remaining Imperial forces. The High Council, On Zarketh convened an emergency session as reports arrived of another rebel victory using captured human weapons. The mammals had somehow shared their impossible technology with other species, and the quantum torpedoes were spreading across the galaxy faster than the Empire's military could respond. Worlds that had been pacified for thousands of years were declaring independence with weapons that made hegemony retaliation impossible. President Brooks addressed the Galactic Liberation Congress that had formed in Earth's orbital space, while representatives from hundreds of species gathered to coordinate their resistance against the crumbling empire. The world that had saved itself through scientific brilliance and determination now led a coalition that would reshape the political structure of civilized space. Communications Officer Martin monitored transmissions from rebel forces across the galaxy while coordinating supply convoys protected by quantum-armed human warships. Earth's industrial capacity had expanded beyond recognition as orbital factories mass-produced the weapons that were liberating species throughout the known galaxy. The technology that had saved one world was now freeing thousands. Dr. Stone published her research on gravitational weaponry through the galactic scientific community while carefully controlling access to the most critical information. The quantum torpedoes represented a revolution in physics that would reshape technology throughout civilized space, but humanity maintained their advantage by protecting the most advanced applications of their discoveries. The Liberty led a fleet of 12 quantum-armed warships toward the Rigel sector, where hegemony forces were attempting to suppress a rebellion that had erupted after local species acquired human weapons technology. The ship that had once fought alone against impossible odds now commanded firepower that could destroy entire fleets without taking significant damage. Captain Morrison reviewed tactical reports while the fleet prepared to engage hegemony forces that still believed their technological superiority could overcome rebel resistance. The alien commanders had not adapted to warfare against weapons that ignored their defensive systems and continued to use tactics that had been obsolete since the Battle of Sol. The quantum torpedo launchers came online as the human fleet approached. The combat zone where hegemony dreadnoughts were bombarding rebel positions on 3 different worlds. The Imperial ships that had once terrorized the galaxy were about to learn why their empire was collapsing as species armed with human technology fought back against millennia of oppression. Chief Engineer Davis reported all systems operational, as the Liberty's crew prepared for combat against an enemy that still had not developed effective countermeasures against gravitational weapons. The hegemony's technological advantage had become a fatal weakness when faced with weapons that attacked the fundamental structure of space-time itself. The rebel alliance that had formed around Earth's leadership now included over 300 species and controlled nearly half the galaxy's inhabited systems. The quantum weapons had tipped the balance of power permanently in favor of freedom and self-determination, while the empire that had seemed eternal crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance. Lieutenant Commander Foster achieved target lock on the lead hegemony dreadnought while the fleet moved into optimal firing position. The ship that had once seemed invincible was about to join the thousands of Imperial vessels that had been destroyed by weapons the aliens still could not understand or counter. Navigation Officer Clark coordinated the fleet's approach, while rebel forces on the surface watched human warships arrive to break the siege that had trapped them for months. The Liberty and its escorts represented hope for species that had never imagined freedom was possible, until one experimental ship had proven that technological superiority meant nothing against determination and ingenuity. The quantum torpedoes streaked toward their targets while the galaxy continued its transformation from empire to alliance. The weapons that had saved Earth were now liberating civilizations throughout known space and proving that courage and scientific achievement could overcome any technological disadvantage when survival and freedom were at stake.